the increase in the defense industry and in this defense and security industry, and as well as the increase in a police state and in an increasingly police state. We're very fortunate today to have my friend Patrick Lamson-Hall, who's a research fellow in urban studies at NYU, here today with us, and he's going to talk about later in the lecture, he'll talk about this rise of this increasingly police state. So, by the end of the 20th century, more than 3 million Americans lived behind walls. Now, these walls range from blockaded public streets all the way to fortified compounds surrounded by electric fencing or physical walls patrolled by security guards. And what these walls shared in common was a sense that their inhabitants needed to protect themselves against something. So the question I'm going to ask today is, what were these people afraid of? What were they trying to protect themselves against? Now, Americans represent about the middle road in our three regions between Latin America and Europe in terms of the actual physical infrastructure of these walled cities. As we'll see later in the lecture, Latin America, much more than either two of the other cases, came to be highly securitized, very, very physical security state by our period today. Europe less so, although the process of securitization, this rise of this police state, as we'll hear from Patrick, is no less extensive. Now, together with that, these actual walling, as I was saying, is this tremendous rise in the security industry, in these defensive security measures. Since 1980, the private security industry has increased by 10% globally. So it's grown at this breakneck pace. In some regions, the growth is even more rapid than that. And so, like I said, in addition to talking about where these walls come, we'll also talk about where these guards come from, who they are, and how they're involved in this process of securitization. Now, I'll argue today in this lecture that these walls are the late 20th century product of neoliberal reforms, and together with that, an increased privatization of what were formerly public things, including space. Okay, so before we get started, one thing, or before we launch into this lecture, one thing I want to distinguish between is risks and threats. Now, I'll define risks as the likelihood of harm, the actual exposure to harm, whereas threats are perceived dangers. They are often subjectively experienced as fear. And these two things are intertwined, obviously. Real risks are often perceived as threatening. But the fear associated is usually not proportional to the actual exposure to harm, right? So the fear associated with particular risks isn't actually proportional to how dangerous they might be to you. Now, if we take classic image here from the civil disturbances in France, in Paris, in 2005, as many of you might know, the accidental electrocution of two teenagers set off this period of civil disturbance, particularly in Paris and Marseille. And this came to dominate news cycles in both Paris and around the world. Images like this one came to symbolize what were called the French riots, in which over 8,000 cars were burned or otherwise destroyed. Now, 2 years after these disturbances in 2007, the French presidential elections, 85% of voters polled said that domestic security was their #1 concern, right? So they're voting on the basis and voting to elect Sarkozy on the basis of this pervasive fear of these riots. Backtrack a second here. In 2004, the year before these riots, auto accidents claimed over 5,000 lives and damaged or destroyed tens of thousands of cars more. So this, in order of magnitude greater than the loss of life or the loss of property that actually occurred in the riots. But you don't see auto accidents, car accidents, as a major factor in the voting. And I will argue that that's because people feared these riots more than they were actually concerned about the far greater risk of dying in a car. To think about one example where risks and threats can operate together in the same vein, for those of you who remember the 19th century version of this class, this is a map of Vienna in the 19th century, and what you can see here is this old, dense city that in the 19th century was surrounded by these extensive fortifications. These fortifications protected the city, obviously. In fact, from one famous example, they protected Vienna from the invasion of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century and his Ottoman army. But by the 19th century, the invention of the cannon had made the walls essentially irrelevant to the risk of an army. So the walls were no longer actually protected the inhabitants from risk. And the 19th century was also, in the middle of the 19th century, was also this period of peace for the Austrian Empire. And so the emperor ordered the walls torn down to create space for this monumental avenue, the Ringstraße, through Vienna here. And he was able to do this, right, because the walls no longer protect against risk, and there also isn't this threat. So you can see how these things might operate together. And what I want you guys to think about during this lecture today is the ways in which securitization and walling respond to both threats and risks, and the way that we might think about pulling those apart as a way to understand where some of this comes from. So to start with, what is the risk of living in cities? What's the real risk? So we'll take this continent by continent here. The question to ask is, did cities grow more dangerous in our period? Now, what you have here mapped is the overall crime rate in Latin America and the United States since 1970. And what you can see is in the United States, there's this growth in crime till about 1980, 1990 or so, with a peak there, and then a general decline. Whereas in Europe, you have this general increase through our period, although in the last half decade or so, it looks like crime appears to be going down in Europe. Now, Latin America, you'll see this is disaggregated between several major countries, including one in the Caribbean. You see a general increase through this period. We'll talk about this as a product of neoliberalism. But the thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these crime rates here is that securitization has continued in essentially in a continuous upward growth. So regardless of the actual risk of crime, securitization has only gone up. And so it's important to think about, so where does this come from? And so, why end up with these walled cities, with this security state, if in some places, or what detaches that walling from the actual risk? And one answer is that fear sells. You have here, your ubiquitous advertisement for a gated community. And real estate developers discovered in the 1970s in Latin America, Europe, and the United States that security could be commodified as a personal good and sold as a personal good. Once you start getting this market provision of security, that creates its own demand. And so security became a prestige symbol in many of these communities, and it became this thing, as you read about in your reading, essentially a required factor in Latin American developments, less so in the United States, and less so in Europe. You can see this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. You have here, this is in English, but an ad for a gated community in Playa del Carmen, and you can see this association between these second home, these luxury developments, and the necessity of securitization. Now, another big seller of this increasingly insecure world, leading to some of this walling and securitization, has been the media. You have here a headline from the LA Times following the 1992 riots that resulted from the acquittal of the 4 LAPD officers charged with assault in the beating of Rodney King. And obviously the violence in response to, the disturbance in response to that acquittal was enormous. I'm not trying to suggest that the media shouldn't report on this, but what you end up with is these specters of criminality. So in a typical image from this, you end up with these brown and black people who are essentially just fulfilling these criminal stereotypes and embodying these criminal stereotypes. And what this obscures is the far more general protest to that acquittal, right? And the far more both racially heterogeneous and also the political aims of much of that protest. It wasn't just looting, but what you end up with is this idea that you have this criminal underclass in the city that in these periodic moments of violence breaks out in criminal behavior. Now, the threat of crime, and we'll hear about this more from Patrick in the policing, but the threat of crime has also been used to justify the intrusion of the state into what were formerly often private realms, and also the imposition of the state on many private liberties. So you have here an ad playing on the 2002, what were called the 2002 DC sniper attacks. And what you can see here is this use of the fear of this sniper as a way to justify this increasing policing. And in this case, the sale of these closed-circuit televisions, right? So these CCTVs, using this fear as a way to sell it. So you have together both the rise of the state and the rise of a defensive industry. Now, what do these physically look like? So I'll go region by region here, starting with the United States. And I apologize if it's a little unclear. What you're looking at here is the number of new securitized unit, number of new wall units being built per year in the U.S. And tracking this in several different periods, or several different sort of events. Now, the first walled communities in the United States went up in the 1970s, and they went up in resort areas, particularly in the Southwest and the Southeast, around golf courses and their attached common interest developments, CIDs. So these are like, a CID is essentially any sort of planned community of any sort. It doesn't have to be walled. And the walls were a mark of prestige. And they tended to be in these highly wealthy communities. And what they allowed was separation and isolation for these communities, right? And so not necessarily from crime, but from essentially the rest of the public. So this increase of privatization in these environments. In the 1980s, walls began to spread to the middle class, and they became increasingly common in new subdivisions where the new cost of construction could cover the walling and the staffing of these guardhouses. So you have here, I'm sure all of you, regardless of where you grew up, had a friend or spent some time around these type of spaces, right? So you have these gated communities, or you've seen them in films or whatever. Now, and this one happens to be in Calabasas, in California, where the Kardashians live. Now, in the in the 1980s and the 1990s, crime became an increasing concern, an increasing driver of this securitization. But as we'll see, securitization increased before this crime wave, or before this perception of crime kicked off. And in many cases, and I apologize, this is probably completely illegible, in many cases, crime was actually falling in this period. So in 1990, 90% of Americans polled thought that crime was getting worse, even though the rate of crime had dropped 25% in the preceding decade. And so this ties into this selling of fear, right? This selling of fear of crime that's actually not connected to actual crime increase. And by 1997, what you end up with is around 20 or 25,000 communities around the United States that are walled. And you can see here that they continue to predominate in the Southeast and the Southwest, as well as in many of these major cities. Together with these CIDs that are sort of on the suburbs or on the edge of a city, you also have the rise of urban gated communities in this period. By 1998, 4 out of 5 new developments in cities were gated or otherwise securitized. You increasingly have gates and walls in public housing, and you have this increase in private residents voting to barricade or otherwise close public streets. So a disruption of these open grid plans in favor of securitized neighborhoods. So literally this privatization of what were public resources. Now, and you can see that here, this is like a typical barricade. This happens to be in Miami, that would go up, and you put this barricade up, and the street that would normally come through here is blocked, and you create essentially a private cul-de-sac in what was formerly a public street. Now, like suburbs, or to a large degree, walling, this process of exclusion, is not a new phenomenon, right? Suburbs, to many degrees, were created, or to a large extent, were created for this very purpose. This idea of secluding yourself from the city, as we know, and as we've heard, like suburbs, gates and walling are in large part a response to this marketing. And together with this, though, there's also this increased privatization of public space, and so you get things like suburbs and edge communities building what you might think of as invisible walls. So choosing to close their city parks on the weekends so that they can exclude the working class who would normally use those parks during that period. And also allowing parking on their city streets only for residents. And you can see governments, local governments, going along with this process, right? So this increased privatization. And you also see the rising importance of homeowners associations, right? And this is crucial to this walling because these homeowners associations are able to govern their communities through these covenants that are bound to the deed. So these agreements that are bound to the property deed. And they increasingly take on the provision of services and the maintenance of order that were formerly the role of the public government. And oftentimes these homeowner associations incorporate themselves on the edge of these metropolitan areas as these edge cities. So you have here Canyon Lake in California, this edge city outside of Los Angeles. Now, turning to Latin America. So Latin America presents somewhat of a different picture. As we talked about in the City of Slums lecture, as you heard in the City of Slums lecture, neoliberal reforms in the 1980s created a surplus labor population that moved into cities and moved into these informal economies. And one thing that a lot of sociologists and historians will argue is that this process of displacement in the industrial labor sector also led to an increase in crime. And you can see that crime rose since that period in many of these countries. Now, in Latin America, as we'll see in Eastern Europe particularly, the failure of the state to curb that rising violence led to a loss of the state's monopoly on force and on the ability to control the population. And so you see both vigilante violence on the rise. You also see, as many of you I'm sure know, in Latin America, you also see an increased deployment of the military to control and police these cities, and that often was successful in increasing the security, but it also came at tremendous cost to human rights and often led to a delegitimization of both the state and the military. Together with this, you also have this tremendous growth of a private security industry in Latin America, really on a scale unmatched in either Europe or the United States. And we'll talk about that a little later when we talk about private security. But one thing to note here is that unlike in the United States, you have increased walling and securitization in response to a real growing risk of crime, right? But as in the United States, these walls predate that increase in crime. So these walls are essentially used in the same way as the United States, both to allow one set of the population to separate themselves, and also increasingly as a way to regulate those people who are left behind in these cities. Now, this is a slide from Caracas here, and what you can see, I want you to note two things here. One, just the spatial proximity between many of these walled communities and really quite poor neighborhoods, what we might call slums, often divided by here, things like these access roads and then increasingly walled. And in contrast to CIDs, these common interest developments in the United States, virtually all CIDs in Latin America are walled. And in Latin America, they often tend to be condominium towers located closer to the central city than you have in these sprawling U.S. suburbs, although you do see horizontal communities start to be built in the 1970s. Now, as you may remember from your reading, in Latin America, these homogeneous cookie-cutter suburbs have been roundly rejected by the middle and the upper class, who prefer architectural distinction, both in condominium towers and in individual houses. And so you end up with a different aesthetic of these cities. Returning here to Alphaville, outside of Sao Paulo, you can see just, and this would be one of the most elite parts of Alphaville, but you can see just what distinction there. This doesn't tend to look like your typical U.S. suburb, for those of you who might know that. Now, continuing with Alphaville for a second here. So, in the 1970s, places like Alphaville started to sell security as a marker of prestige. This is 10 years, in the case of Sao Paulo, this is 10 years before crime rates started to rise in Sao Paulo. The threat of violence, right? This fear of violence was being used and played upon and amplified to sell the security, the commodification of security in these places. Now the scale of securitization only grew from there. By 1990, Alphaville's 20,000 residents were protected by about 800 private security guards. So you can see just this tremendous growth of this private security industry, and the violence of this protection, the violence of this exclusion on the outsiders, people who are excluded, as you have in your reading, was increasingly normalized, right? And so people were comfortable or completely oblivious to the violence that policed these boundaries. Now in Latin America, CIDs have tended to be more racially segregated, more intensely racially segregated than in U.S. cities, which, for those of you who remember our